December 28th, 29th of 1888. But nothing beyond that. Okay. And we know the chapter titles of Ecce Homo, right?
Yeah.
The chapter title of chapter 1 is
Why am I
so
am so wise. And the chapter title of chapter 2 is
Why I am
so clever. And the chapter title of chapter 3 is
Why I
write
such good
good
books.
books. And the chapter title of chapter 4 is
Why I am the destiny.
Why I am a destiny. Okay. And last time we said that the important thing to remember about Ecce Homo is that it is a forward, intended to be a forward, to a full-volume work. And well, we don't know what happened. The full-volume work did not appear. What did appear was what was supposed to be volume 1 of the full-volume work, and that volume was called the Antichrist. But it's possible that by the time he decided to just publish the first book of the full-volume work, it's possible that he wasn't even thinking about a full-volume work at all. But we don't know that. It's also possible that he was attracting a lot of attention at the time and beginning to think that, if I write Ecce Homo and I write the Antichrist and I publish them together, that might have a really significant impact. And I don't think I'm getting anywhere with these big, long, bloated works. People are not following them, they're not getting into them, they're not understanding them. Maybe I should just concentrate on these shorter things. Now, if he had been successful in the project of Ecce Homo as forward plus the Antichrist, and it got him the attention that he was hoping it would get him, and he was sitting here 6 months later feeling quite successful and recognized, I kind of think he would have written another book. And probably the material for that book would have come from the remaining 3 volumes. So even though Nietzsche's creative life ended at this time, at the end of what we said was the Turin period, which starts in the middle of September, even though his creative life ended, we don't know that he considered his life work completed at that time. All we know is that he chose to write a shorter work for the public because, and we know that he was beginning to attract a great deal of attention and thinking that the shorter works would really solidify his reputation. Whereas long works are kind of tedious and boring and people don't get it and have to wade through it. And there's a great temptation on the part of authors to write shorter and more comprehensible works. Okay. Well, but we are left with the following as the last thought-through plan. We are left with Ecce Homo as the forward, plus the Antichrist as the work that was to appear with it, plus the plans for the full-volume work. We have 6 plans for the work called the Revaluation of All Values in the notebooks, and all the plans were pretty much the same. So we could guess pretty much what was in his mind, at least, through October and November. Although possibly after November, he changed his mind and decided maybe not to publish the remaining 3 volumes. But regardless, there's still an idea of the revaluation of all values in mind. Values revaluation, and in writing Homo, and in the Antichrist as the first volume, as he at one time planned. And we said that at the center of his revaluation is the concept of equal rights and pity. Pity is so there's kind of a complementary ideas here. One is an idea from social and political philosophy, which is the idea of equal rights, and the other idea, pity, belongs to the study of what we call moral psychology. That's a whole area of philosophy that's extremely fascinating. Understanding Nietzsche's moral psychology is probably the hardest part of it. So we're going to look at some texts that explore the moral psychology of pity, because pity, the moral psychology of pity is supposed to undergird the social and political philosophy of equal rights. It's because we are supposed to feel with and for each other. That's what pity means. To feel with and for each other. And if I feel with and for you, I feel your situation, then I can then put myself into your situation, and then I see that I should treat you in the same manner that I would wish to be treated, because I'm kind of treating myself that way, because I see myself in you. And in return, you see yourself in me, and you treat me as you would treat yourself. So this concept of pity, compassion, feeling with and for each other is the basis of an idea of our having equal rights. I will not advance my rights above yours to cause you a setback, because I can see myself in you, and I will be sort of causing myself a setback. And I can understand why I should do that. Kind of by nature, I sort of naturally understand that I would not hurt my own interests, hurt myself. Something like that. Yeah. Okay. Now, on the other hand, I have Ecce Homo, Why I Am So Wise, section 4, which is a complicated section. I'm only going to look at one sentence of section 4, and then I'm going to read section 5. And both sections I'm going to focus, because it's a very condensed text, so you really have to study it little by little by little. I'm going to focus on the thoughts of equal rights and pity as they appear in sections 4 and 5 of Ecce Homo, Why I Am So Wise. Okay. Just something to notice that we'll mention this time and again. Notice that section 4 begins with a reference to his father. I've never understood the art of taking people against me, or maybe it would be better to translate as saying, I've never understood the art of making people hold a grudge or hold anything against me, be mad at me, or wanting to strike back at me. I have my incomparable father to thank for that too. What I wanted you to notice is that section 4, because we've talked about how the opening sentence of section 1 is the happiness of my existence, to express it in the form of a riddle, is that as my father I am already dead, and as my mother I am still living and growing old, this double descent from the highest and lowest rung in the ladder of life. So we asked ourselves, why is Nietzsche opening the autobiography, which is supposed to introduce his work and make sure that there's no terrible misunderstandings about it? The work of the reevaluation is supposed to say who he is. Why does he open up the subject of who he is with talk about his father? And I said, the best after the time time I've looked at it, the best interpretation I have of that line comes from the subject of epigenetics. There simply is no doubt that Nietzsche would not have had the interest he did in these subjects were he not the child of his father. And the significant fact of his father's life that comes to the fore as the cause of him having this interest is unquestionably the fact that he died of some kind of brain disease, which took one quarter of his brain when Nietzsche was 4 years, 10 months old, which was very possibly tuberculosis of the brain, which means that it had its onset some years before Nietzsche's birth, because tuberculosis is very slow acting. And so it's possible that, I'm not saying that it had to happen, but it's possible that as his father's brain was losing function in certain of its centers, it could have been that his genes would have had to have been, genes that had been not active would have had to have been activated in order for other cells in his brain to take over function from the parts of the brain that have been losing function. This is a possible scenario, it's not no means certain. And if that was happening, the activation of those genes controlling those brain cells would have been started with the coding on his epigene. And Nietzsche could have inherited that because the epigenetic coding that would have caused brain cells to rewire themselves to take on activities that they had not before taken on, that same coding would have reproduced itself in all 200 and whatever different types of cells that are in the body. So it would have been in the sperm cells, and the sperm cells reproduce themselves on a daily basis. So one scenario is that as his brain disease was progressing, matching that progress was an updated epigene in his sperm cells daily. That's possible. We don't know that. We're never going to know that. The reason why I'm hesitant about that is because it's very possible that other centers of his brain did not take over for activity in other, as it was being lost in other centers. Maybe that didn't happen. However, something seems to have happened. Another possibility is that his father, let's say, had suffered considerable mental trauma as a result of his gradual loss of brain functioning, and that mental trauma developed and worsened, and that was the emotional environment into which Nietzsche was born. And we do know that environmental factors can influence the epigene, especially in the first few months of development. So another possibility is that his father's psychology would have affected Nietzsche in his fetal development, especially in his first 3 months, and that would have been reflected in his epigene. How to understand it, we don't know, but I feel fairly sure that the science that we have today that would investigate that question is the science of epigenetics. So, one, I think it's plain that Nietzsche would not have had these interests unless he had been a child of his father. Two, I think it's clear that the feature of his father that is relevant to Nietzsche's interest centers on his circumstances that led to his brain disease. And three, I think that the only scientific way to explore that is with epigenetics, and we know very little, but maybe as epigenetics advances, the tiny bit we know will say more to us. Okay, now I'm not going to be very exact about what this particular introduction about his father means in connection with section 4. Let's just notice that section 4 opens with a reference to his father. I'm going to skip that because also this section 5. Let me just skip ahead quickly to section 5. See, that this becomes, so you have to read the references to his father in connection with what all else is said in those sections. So this is section 5. I don't know where the number 5 is. In another respect, too, I am just being my father once again, and as it were, his continuing life after an all too early death. Wow. In another respect as well, I am just my father over again, and the seeming continuation of his life after an all too early death. This section we will go into in a little detail, but note that we're going to have to deal with the introduction of his father as an important concept in what else is developed in this section. Let me go back to the previous section now and introduce you to the one sentence about pity that I want to discuss. Right here. Right here. I want to pay attention to every line there. My experiences give me a right to be thoroughly mistrustful of the so-called selfless drives, altruism, pity, of all brotherly love, ready with word and deed. In itself, it strikes me as a weakness. Selfless drives, a specific instance of the inability to resist stimuli. What does any of this mean? Only the decadent calls compassion, a synonym for pity, a virtue. Are we in the universe of the revaluation of all values? We are indeed. I hold it against the compassionate that they easily lose sight of shame. Are we in the universe of moral psychology? Indeed we are. Reverence, sensitivity to distances, that in a thrice compassion, in a thrice, meaning very soon after having been exposed to a compassionate person, you will recognize the atmosphere of the mob. It smells, it has the feeling of the mob about it, and looks for all the world like bad manners. Because the is characterized as having bad manners and not realizing it. And the bad-mannered, compassionate man displays his bad manners in his inability to hold the boundary of distances. Sensitivity to distances, that's the lack of manners. The compassionate person violates boundaries that in a noble culture should not be violated. What does that mean? And why is that? And how is that? And what, I mean, those, so far we just have some words, but we don't have any actual analysis of anything else. That compassionate hands may even wreak utter destruction as they plunge into a great destiny, and isolation among wounds, a right to a heavy burden of guilt. Okay. I count the overcoming of compassion among the noble virtues. Right. So just a tiny little bit of the sense of a revaluation of the value of pity, but I want to focus just on this thought, my experiences. Because when he says here, compassionate hands can wreak utter destruction as they plunge into a great destiny and isolation among wounds, a right to a heavy burden of guilt. He's referring to his own experience. So my experience of compassion is that in my great destiny, or in my isolation, in which I was seeking to heal up my wounds, but for our purposes today, most importantly, in my right to a heavy burden of guilt, pity intruded destructively. Let's just put that sentence down. We want to study Ecce Homo like we're looking at a math problem, a math proof. Pity intruded in its ill-mannered way destructively how destructively in my right, or could also be translated as privilege, correct, to a heavy burden of guilt. Pity, in my life, my experience has been that pity in its ill-mannered way, intruded destructively upon, we better say upon my right to a heavy burden of guilt. Okay. So you're right to say, what are you talking about? What heavy burden of guilt? How can there be such a thing as a right to a heavy burden of guilt? Well, what is that? What does any of this mean? What? I kind of see a little bit of meaning there, but not much. And you know, I can understand the idea of a mob, pity, as I understand his sentence at least, that the pity smells of the mob, it smells of ill manners and everyday common people, and I understand his idea of an aristocratic culture in which pity is seen as something one should overcome. I kind of get that. And I kind of get the idea that in that aristocratic culture, not everyone has the same rights. So pity is intruding in its democratic way, violating in its democratic and ill-mannered way, violating the boundaries that are supposed to protect my noble privileged right. Okay. Fine, I see that. But what I don't get is, why would the right be a right to a heavy burden of guilt? And so that's one. Why a right to guilt? And two, why does pity focus on guilt? Now those are difficult questions. And the answers are not in Ecce Homo Wise 4. They are in Ecce Homo Wise 5. Okay, back to Wise 5. I realize I'm kind of jumping around here, but that's because I'm trying to organize a particular theme, so I'm not reading it in the order you presented it. So, Wise 5 opens with this reference to his father, which we're going to have to understand, but we're not going to understand until we're done. I don't know if we'll get to it at the end of the day. Yeah, we might. Getting this in a half hour might be asking too much. So, in another way too, which I'm about to tell you, I am my father again. And the seeming continuation of his life after his old early death. Now, let me orient you a tiny bit to that. That would be kind of nice if that were true, sort of. I mean, his father died at 36 years old. And I think we should read this as a kind of loving idea that, oh, my poor dad, he died at such an early age at 36. That was terrible. And whatever I mean here, which I haven't explained, I haven't explained, whatever I mean here, says Nietzsche, by continuing his life after that too soon and early death, is a loving gesture. Now, but maybe just from the sentence itself, we can garner a thought of a loving gesture toward his father. Now comes this bear of a sentence. Notice that we're at the end of the page, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines in no period. This is a brutally difficult sentence to understand. It's probably the most difficult sentence in Ecce Homo. In fact, I think section 5 is the most difficult section in Ecce Homo. That's what I kind of want to get to. Like anyone who has never lived among his equals, so just how many concepts do we want to just count off? We've got his father. We've got the continuation of his father's life. And now we've got, like anyone who has never lived among his equals, and we've got the idea of never living among your equals, so there's a third concept, and who has very little grasp of the concept of retaliation, no more grasp of it than he does of the concept of equal rights. So, I don't know, maybe living among equal rights should not be counted separately from living among his equals, so let's not. But let's say we have retaliation, so there's a fourth concept, then we have a connection between retaliation and equal rights. That's a fifth thought we have to work through. In cases where a minor or very great act of folly is committed against me, I forbid myself any countermeasures, any protective measures. Likewise, as is only proper, any defense, any justification. That way too much sentence. We will understand every nuance of that. We will understand equal, we will understand living among your equals, we will understand equals in relationship to retaliation, we will understand why equal rights are connected to retaliation, we will understand how the overcoming of equal rights is a continuation of his father's early death with life. It is so because he overcomes his epigenetic father and gives that, turns that in himself to something living. But let's skip that and look just here. The narrative is when something is, a wrongdoing is committed to me, whenever any great, in cases where a minor or a very great act of folly is committed against me, in other words, when someone does me a wrong, that's what he's talking about. That might not be obvious, but it'll be obvious. And you know, we have translation issues, but it'll be obvious as we get on. Where either some small or grave wrongdoing is committed against me, I forbid myself. I'm going to stop making sense fast. I forbid myself any countermeasures, any protective measures, likewise, any justification. My kind of retaliation. So we had the idea, the narrative is, as often happens in life, people commit wrongdoings against me. When someone commits a wrongdoing against me, I forbid myself retaliation, any effort to strike back. Why? Any thoughts? It's okay. The reason why is because when Nietzsche describes himself as on the lowest rung on the ladder of life, that translates, or I mean in language, but conceptually, that translates into a state of feelings. What he's saying is that my aliveness in me is consumed and burned up with feelings of vengefulness and vindictiveness. And that's what that means. When weakness is overwhelming me, that's what I mean by already dead. Weakness, declining, no life, cannot hold on to life, weak decaying, slipping away, cannot hold on to it. And the psychology of weakness is to want to strike back. The feeling of weakness spawns, creates the feeling of wanting to retaliate. Weakness wants to avenge itself for its weakness. I'm going to have to put that up somewhere. Weakness. Nature. Weakness wants to strike back in retaliation. Weakness wants to strike back in retaliation for being weak. Does that kind of make an intuitive sense? The weaker you are, the more you decay, the more you decline, the less strong you are becoming, the more hostile and antagonistic, resentful, and revengeful you become. You might have to just think that through for a day or so until it becomes intuitive. Weakness wants to strike back in retaliation for its being weak. In fact, I would think Nietzsche would say that weakness and wanting to strike back in retaliation are the same psychology. To be weak and to desire to strike back in retaliation are the same psychology. So, for someone who is at the lowest rung on the ladder of life, the greatest weakness imaginable, he thinks, to strike back is a catastrophe. If I have to do anything with this epigenetic inheritance I have, I've got to control myself from wanting to strike back, or I'm going to just be completely sucked into this. This is killing me. This is the path of declining life. If the moment, so here I am walking around in the world with this hypersensitivity to situations of retaliation. And the world is full of reasons to be resentful. Someone talked ill to me, someone was cruel to me, someone was unjust to me. Mostly someone is unjust to me. Boy, oh boy. If there's ever a concept that really enrages us and makes us want to strike back in retaliation, it's the concept of being unjustly treated. I was right, I was in the right, and I was mistreated. Welcome to the revaluation of moral value. I was in the right, but I was mistreated. What could be more obvious than that? I was in the right, and I was mistreated, so I should strike back. I am entitled not to be mistreated. But for Nietzsche, coming into the world with this hypersensitivity to the destructive effects on himself of feeling retaliation, when he, wandering through the course of his life, encounters circumstances just as the rest of us do that would provoke him to retaliate, he has to control that because of his extreme weakening start. So, the problem is, unless I control my desire to strike back when life presents me with the occasions as it presents everyone with occasions to strike back, unless I control that, I will never, ever, ever, ever get off my back of being already dead. I will never control my epigenetic father. I will be his lack of life force and physically die, I will reach his psychological point of death. Huh? So, I don't do what's expected. And in not doing what was expected, I learned something. I learned that when I didn't do what was expected, and in fact when I fought against the psychology of striking back, I created life in myself. I became more alive. I overcame the epigenetic inheritance of my father and mastered it. I mastered compulsive wishing to strike back. I mastered that weakening in myself, and I strengthened life in myself, and I was more richly and abundantly alive. And as I was going through these experiences, I began to study the whole moral psychology of striking back and equal entitlement, not to be wronged, and the injustice and the feelings of being unjustly wronged. And I have to tell you, all of those feelings, they all belong to a world of powered, fueled by the feelings of retaliation and resentment. And if you want to be in the future world of beings of overflowing life, you're going to have to revalue all of those concepts of being entitled not to be wronged. You have to revalue the whole moral psychology of having a right to be angry for wrongdoing to you. You're going to have to reverse that in yourself. Otherwise, humanity will not make this leap forward. So in this section, we are going to see a fundamental reevaluation of the value of entitlement not to be wronged and the injustice of it. And essentially, we're revaluing Christianity. Because remember I said last time, in the Christian story, the idea is that humanity is sinful, and so no human being could put himself forward as worthy to make up with God for the fight between humanity and God. In the ancient world, fights with deities were generally solved by offering them a sacrifice, and then they would feel better. That idea is satirized harshly in some of the Greek comic writers. Aristophanes played the cows. There's a satire of the idea that the gods feel better because we burn chunks of beef and chunks of ox to them, and instead of eating it ourselves and make the sacrifice, and they get that smoke and they feel better and they're happy because they know we love them. Well, by the time we got to Christianity, a hunk of beef wasn't enough. We had to sacrifice something more. But no human being was worthy was a good enough sacrifice for God. So, because we're all sinful and impure and unclean. So, God sent his only son, Jesus. What makes Jesus unique is Jesus does not have the stain of original sin. Did you know that? See? The knowledge I get to bring to China. Remember, the next book in the series is The Antichrist. Really the anti-Christian, but it doesn't really translate as Antichrist, but Nietzsche knew the possibility that he could be putting himself in the role of being the Antichrist. In the book of Revelations in the Bible, there's foretold the coming of the Antichrist. Now, Antichrist does not mean Antichrist, but Nietzsche knew it would have those overtones and people would hate him for declaring himself the Antichrist. But in fact, Antichrist in German means the Anti-Christian. So, there's Jesus, without stain of original sin, who is completely innocent. And this completely innocent being must die. Now, what greater wrong could there be than the wrongdoing of an innocent, a supremely innocent in a new way that we have not even had a concept of it, that we can only dream of. A superhuman innocence. The superhumanly innocent being was wrongfully, it must be because there was no crime, is wrongfully executed. So if there's any psychological nerve that you can probe in Christianity, it's that idea of I'm entitled to, I'm entitled not to suffer a wrongdoing. I'm innocent.
Wait, I'm sorry.
No problem. I'm innocent, and I have been wronged, and I'm entitled not to be wronged because I'm innocent. And that is the essence of the Christian concept. Jesus, obviously, the whole joy of Christianity is, oh, he was innocent and he was entitled not to be wronged and not to be killed, but he was. And what a terrible world the place is. A terrible place the world is. I'm thinking ahead. Okay. Now, Alicia says, all right, I'm going to engage this concept that when a wrong is committed to me, my first reaction is to the entitlement, the equal right, not to be wrong. I'm tying up equal rights and retaliation. My kind of retaliation, my kind, which is the revaluation of all values kind, consists in sending something clever to chase after stupidity as quickly as possible. Clever is, in the translation, the word translated is Klugheit, and the word for stupidity is Dummheit, so they're meant to rhyme. My kind of retaliation consists in sending something, I don't know exactly what you mean here by Klugheit, but something prudent. Clever is not the best translation for Klugheit. Prudent is the better translation for Klugheit. Prudent. So retaliation sends something prudent to chase after the stupidity of wrongdoing as quickly as possible. I send a pot of preserves to get rid of a sour story. One need only do something bad to me and I will repay. Of that one can be sure, but what kind of repayment do we have? I will find an opportunity to express my thanks to the wrongdoer. Wait, what?
Thanks.
My thanks to the, and thanks is an important concept in Ecce Homo because we haven't looked at the epilogue, not the epilogue, the epigraph. We haven't looked at the epigraph, but the epigraph to Ecce Homo is an expression of his great gratitude for his whole life. So any expression of thankfulness is relevant to the major theme of the book. So instead of expressing my anger, my entitlement not to have been wrong, excuse me, but I am in the right, and because we have equal entitlement. Because, see, being in the right doesn't mean that I should not have been wronged unless we have equal rights. Does it? See how that works? After all, in the ancient world, the emperors did wrong things to people all the time. And they were slaves. And they didn't say, I have a right, not because you didn't have equal rights. So the idea that I have a right not to be wrong presupposes that we have equal rights. But instead of confronting the wrongdoer with my equal right not to be wrong, I thank him. Thanks for doing that to me. What? And even sometimes for the wrongdoing itself. Sometimes I might ask him for something, which can be even more obliging, kinder to him. I show an even greater kindness to him. Kindness? Why would you be showing him kindness? That's the opposite of the norm of the psychology here. I'm not saying that that psychology is put forward as the psychology of what is right, but in fact, it's the underlying psychology of Christianity, wrongdoing. And instead, I ask for something, and even asking for them can be more obliging him something. It seems to me, let's skip that. Let's skip that. Okay. Let's skip through here. Bearing in mind that we just read a sentence in section 4 about a right to guilt. If you are rich enough to deal with it, rich enough in life, it is even a stroke of luck to be wrong. To be wronged. To be. A God came to earth. He should do nothing but wrong, taking on himself not the punishment but the guilt. That would be divine. If you're rich enough to deal with it, it could even be a good fortune for you to be in the wrong. If a God were to come to earth, and this is, you couldn't have a clearer contrast to Christianity and clearer revaluation, remembering again that this is the forward to the Antichrist. If a God come to earth, Jesus is the God who came to earth, he should only take upon himself not the punishment as Jesus did, but the guilt. That would be divine. What are you talking about? So let me see here. Are you suggesting this? Someone has done something to you, and it is a wrongdoing. And ordinarily, you would assert your right not to be wronged, and express your anger to the wrongdoer. And instead, you are developing in yourself a psychology of taking the guilt for the wrongdoing upon yourself and saying, oh, excuse me, that wrong? I must have been guilty for it. Notice how saying that wrong, I must have been guilty for it, is exactly the opposite psychology of I'm entitled not to be wrong. I've just completely destroyed that mind that says, hey, you wronged me, I'm entitled not to be wronged. I have equal rights, and I'm entitled not to be wronged. You should not have done that. I'm an innocent, and you wronged me. Instead, I create in myself the exact opposite outlook, and I take the guilt for the wrongdoing upon myself. I say, oh, my heavens, let me offer as a gracious act toward you my guilt. It must have been my guilt that, and not your wrongdoing. I am the guilty party in this situation. No wrong has been committed against me. That's crazy, in a sense. It has absolutely no, it makes no sense according to moral thinking. The wrongdoer commits a wrong against me, and yet I feel guilt for his wrongdoing. Makes no sense from the point of view of moral thinking, but it makes lots of sense from the point of view of trying to overcome the desire to retaliate. As Nietzsche says, the moment that I sit here and say, I am entitled not to be wrong, the moment I start there, the moment I assert my equal rights, I am your equal, and I am entitled not to be wrong. The moment I start there, I begin the process of retaliation. That's what he said. Equal rights are as foreign to me as the thought of retaliation, because they're the same idea. I'm right not to be wrong is the beginning of retaliation. So I do exactly the opposite. Instead of seeing that I am wrong, I erase the concept of wrong from the world and make myself guilty. Now, is that easy to do? No. In fact, it's probably the closest thing to turning your mind inside out as you can get. Here's a guy whose first instinct, by the endowment of his father, his first reaction to wrongdoing is to throw at it all of the feelings of being wrong, and being angry for being wrong, and wanting to strike back, and being innocent, that you can imagine. And what he's done is master all of those feelings by fabricating in himself, artificially, completely artificially. It's not as if he truly is guilty, it's meaningless. I've just destroyed the whole concept of guilt, wrongdoing, who's guilty, what the wrongdoing was, who did who wrong. Who cares? None of that's meaningful. That's just all moral nonsense that human beings create. There's guilt, there's wrongdoing. There's no such thing. Those are just fabrications that human beings put as tags on events. What I've done is fabricate in myself a psychology of guilt. And not out of, because I'm so nice to you, but because fabricating that psychology of guilt, it reverses my inclination to want to retaliate. And in reversing the inclination to retaliate, by taking the guilt for your wrongdoing upon myself, instead of entrenching myself and saying, I have been wrong. No, I'm not wrong. I, rather, excuse me, Heavenly Guilty Party, I offer you